In tower blocks covered in unsafe cladding are being forced to pay extra service charges to make sure their homes are safe, according to the Greater Manchester High Risk Task Force. In some cases, tenants have seen costs increase by more than fivefold to replace cladding and pay for additional fire wardens. Let's speak to the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, who set up the Greater Manchester High Rise Task Force. Many thanks indeed for joining us this morning, Mr. Burnham. How would you describe what is going on here?
You're welcome. I would describe it as a living nightmare for those people who are trapped in this situation. So, through no fault of their own, they're in a home where they're now worrying about their safety. They've seen the value of that home collapse because of the safety issues. And some of them, as our survey today shows, are paying a large amount of money on a monthly basis to pay for interim safety measures. So, on every level, their life has been turned upside down, and they're now kind of trapped in this limbo where no one's coming in to help them. It's really not acceptable. What we see is the mental health of those people, thousands of them in the big cities like Manchester, Birmingham, London, in a situation where they are really suffering, but at the moment they're getting no help from the government, and it's not acceptable.
And this is affecting people who aren't wealthy in the first instance.
Yeah, that's right, just ordinary people. I mean, I've been to meetings through our task force where we've had residents present, and ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, but absolutely in despair, really, because they're trying to fight this, but they can't, because it's such a massive issue. And people in tears, really at their wits' end. And it was when I was at a meeting recently that I said, look, this just can't carry on. And I committed to hold this lobby of Parliament. So that will take place on Tuesday. We've got MPs like Hilary Benn, Lucy Powell, who've been leading the campaign. But by coming together now with mayors from the big cities, we think we can kind of get this issue raised properly ahead of the budget. And I hope the government will use the budget to sort this terrible situation out.
As the Mayor of Greater Manchester, I mean, do you have any powers to stop this from happening to people?
No, I don't. This is a situation that's not of our making at this level, and certainly not of the residents' making. I would say it's a failure of regulations at a national level, but also I think the property industry may bear some of the responsibility here, and it has to be sorted out at that level, the national level, with government working with the property industry. They've got to remove this cladding. There was a fire here in Salford in a building with cladding Thursday, just a couple of days ago, and people will remember the fire in Bolton last year. That was very reminiscent of Grenfell, and it was a miracle actually that nobody was seriously hurt there. So every day that the government leaves this cladding on these buildings is another day when they're gambling with people's safety, and it really isn't acceptable, and it mustn't be allowed to carry on any longer.
There are 17,000 households in the country, privately owned blocks with similar cladding to what we saw at Grenfell. I mean, we are potentially talking about thousands of people here.
We are, and I think this is the issue. The government's only done half a job at best here. So they've found money to remove the Grenfell-style cladding, which was called ACM cladding, but not other forms of cladding. And in Bolton, it was a different form of cladding that caught fire. So they've got to face up to the full scale of this situation. When an issue like Grenfell happens, you have to face up to all of the consequences. You should do so as quickly as possible. It seems to me that the government can find money for all kinds of things these days, for blue passports, for 50p coins, for renovating Big Ben and Parliament. I mean, you name it, there's a long list of things that they quickly find money for. But when it comes to residents in this situation, who, as we have shown today, whose mental health is severely damaged by the situation that they find themselves in, the living nightmare they're trapped in, there's no money to help them. Well, why not? This is a serious issue, damaging lives up and down the country, and you have to look in those circumstances to national government to step in and help people, and they haven't done so, and it's wrong. We're almost 3 years on from Grenfell here, and that's 3 years when they've been gambling with the public safety, and this now must come to an end. They must remove this cladding and allow the residents to get on with their lives.
And also on that point on the government stepping in and also government finding money for things, I know the Greater Manchester region hasn't been affected so much by the floods, but it could well do in the future. What do you make of the way that the government, the Prime Minister specifically, has handled the flooding that we've seen over the last few weeks?
Well, honestly, I don't think it's been good enough. Again, it's felt like a bit of a half a response. You know, where was the Cobra meeting? Because that's what's needed in these situations, that immediate coordination of support for the residents in those places, and indeed the councils who are often left battling on their own. And you know, it's kind of similar in some ways to the cladding issue. You know, some of these issues don't feel to me as though they're being gripped at a national level. And that is something the government has to put right. You can't leave underfunded councils struggling to deal with floods that are way beyond the normal thing that they have to deal with. Nor should you leave residents in high-rise blocks with cladding on trying to kind of go through the legal minefield of trying to sort things out with their property developer. I mean, none of that is right. Government has to act in certain circumstances. I think we've seen a culture build up in this country in recent times where government is absent on many issues. Well, it can't be, I'm afraid, and the leadership needs to come from the top. And I do make this appeal to the Prime Minister today. Kind of listen to the stories of people who are trapped in buildings with unsafe cladding. You know, kind of imagine what it must be like to be them when you're worrying about the safety of your home, your children, where the value of your home has collapsed. Where you're paying extra service charges. Think about what it is to be them today and do the right thing.
And on the point, so there are a lot of questions at the moment about whether the Prime Minister should be more visible when it comes to issues like this, issues about cladding and people's safety and welfare, also about his visibility during the floods. I mean, as a senior politicians, what is your view? Does the Prime Minister need to be more visible? Because the argument goes is that he is doing work behind the scenes and his ministers, the Environment Minister, in the case of the floodings, is across the brief.
Well, yes, I'm not coming on here to score cheap political points. You know, the Prime Minister called me after the fire in Bolton. I'm sure he'll remember that call, and I appreciated it. But I think we both agreed on that call that it was a miracle, actually, that people weren't more seriously hurt, and it was only the great actions of Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service that prevented that happening. They sent an evacuation command to that building as well as a fire command, and that was a learning from Grenfell. But, you know, kind of having seen that situation, I do now appeal to him that you've got to follow through on those things. And, you know, we can't allow any more fires on buildings with cladding, and that leadership does need to come from the top. So I hope he's been working behind the scenes on this issue. I hope he's been developing a plan with the new Chancellor for the budget, because that is exactly what you expect a Prime Minister to be doing. If you have a situation where the mental health of thousands of our fellow citizens is suffering badly as a result of the limbo they find themselves in through no fault of their own, that is exactly the kind of situation that the government will step into to resolve. And I do make this appeal to him. You know, that kind of visible leadership is badly needed right now by residents in these high-rise blocks up and down the country.
OK, Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, he set up the Greater Manchester High Rise Task Force. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.